The title of this video lecture is Sex in the Civil War, An Untold Story. As a disclaimer, I will apologize in advance that some of the language in this lecture and photographs are explicit and possibly offensive from a racial standpoint. And these are all done in good taste, I hope, and as a humble and accurate reporting of history. These terms do come up and I think are important for the accurate representation of the events of that era. This topic is a hugely overlooked aspect of the war and the culture of the camps, as we explore further into what Civil War soldiers and their leaders were like. Much is written about the multiple lofty motives to fight for the common soldier, North and South, and their courageous actions in combat, but the much darker sides of their lives as combatants are rarely discussed. This lecture covers mostly the sexual escapades and distribution of pornography on the Union side. Confederates had a chronic paper shortage and much more limited publishing capacity than did the North, and thus we have limited documentation of their salacious activities during the war. Also, the Confederates destroyed much of their war records as Richmond fell in April of 1865, so we have limited access to their court-martial records and other legal proceedings that may have been generated over sexual misconduct charges. Most soldiers intentionally left no record of their wartime sexual activities, although their diaries were quite candid about other aspects of the war. The U.S. military did not screen the letters mailed by Union soldiers in the field to their families back home. Any records and letters or journals of sexual activities were destroyed by survivors and family. As stated before, the Confederates destroyed many of their official government records. Enlisted Union soldiers could purchase through the mail pornographic books published in the size, shape, and coverings as Bibles. Young Union fighting men eagerly sought out the readily available prostitutes in the captured southern cities and in Washington, D.C., and had access to those prostitutes who followed the armies. Union officials in occupied Nashville and Memphis legalized and regulated prostitution to help control rampant venereal disease among the troops, with some success. The end stages of venereal disease were responsible for thousands of deaths, lumped into the general reporting category of death from disease. Civil War records of death from disease often did not name the specific disease in an individual soldier's records, and military doctors had poor concept of disease processes in general. There were many court-martial accounts of rape and other sexual indiscretions among both officer and enlisted men, again, mostly in surviving Union records. Many court-martials for alleged rape failed to convict the officer. It is difficult to find factual data from the war concerning salacious sexual behavior. Erotica produced during the Civil War that still exists is mainly in the hands of private collectors. Much of the rest has been destroyed, pages ripped out of books, or just vanished. Two more modern books I would suggest as readings on this subject include The Story the Soldiers Wouldn't Tell by Thomas Lowry and Sex in the Civil War by Judith Geisberg. A historic series of texts was published after the war that also provides excellent reference to this subject, which is the medical and surgical histories of the War of the Rebellion, shown here. I would throw in one fairly amusing personal anecdote from my younger years in college at Princeton. As an undergraduate there in the late 1970s, the upkeep of our old Gothic Revival dormitories was performed mostly by 55 to 60-year-old men who were European immigrants to the U.S. after World War II, and most were veterans who fought on the side of the Allies in Europe. However, to hear them converse about their wartime experiences, you'd think that World War II was nothing more than Allied soldiers marching across France from one whorehouse to the next. There are two major categories of topics that we will cover here, and these include sexual activity during the war and the distribution of pornographic materials. Other subtopics we'll go over include the prostitution during the Civil War, of course. Also, we'll look at court-martials for sexual indiscretions, Confederate court-martial records burned when Richmond evacuated in April of 1865. Union court-martial records listed over 100,000 incidents of sexual misconduct during the war. We'll look at the subject of venereal disease. Then there is the lack of legislative response to the pornography industry during the war. All U.S. legislation on this area came after the war, such as the Comstock Act of 1873. Anthony Comstock was a private in the 17th Connecticut Regiment. Technically, Comstock laws are still on the books. There's the subject of homosexual activity among troops. We will not do a formal review of this subject, but one can read Walt Whitman's accounts of Union camps as a reference to this subject. Then we'll look at forms of contraception and abortion during the war. And finally, the topics of sexual assault. There were institutions in America advocating for morality during the war. The YMCA was founded in New York City in 1852. Then there was the United States Christian Commission, which was founded during the war. Finally, the clergy, both North and South, certainly played a role in the camps in defining moral behavior. We also can identify prominent military leaders who were noted for their moral clarity during the war. These included the Confederate General Robert E. Lee, Thomas Stonewall Jackson. We think of Abraham Lincoln as having moral clarity and leadership for the Union side. And then there were junior officers such as Elijah Hunt Rhodes, whose biography and diary were highlighted in the 1990 PBS series on the Civil War. In looking at the subject of pornography during the Civil War, we may struggle with even definitions of that term. Are there any good ones that exist in our history that we can rely on? For example, the U.S. Supreme Court has taken up the subject of pornography throughout the years, and sometimes it boils down to the expression, "I know it when I see it," in terms of legal definition. Actually, the phrase, "I know it when I see it," was used in 1964 by United States Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart to describe his threshold test for obscenity in the Jacobellis versus Ohio case. There are other legal definitions related to pornography. For example, prurient interest. One could say whether the average person, applying contemporary community standards, finds the work appeals to a prurient or shameful or morbid interest in sex. The term patently offensive is defined, whether the work depicts or describes in a patently offensive way sexual conduct specifically defined by the applicable state law. Then the terminology lack of value. This is whether the work taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. The United States Supreme Court did not define pornography more broadly than these terms. It distinguished between protected, sexually explicit speech and unprotected obscenity. Obscenity has no First Amendment protection, according to the court. The modern definition of obscenity stems from Miller v. California, a Supreme Court decision in 1973. For the subject of sexual activity during the Civil War, we'll next look at excerpts from select soldier letters and diaries penned during the war as first-hand observers. First, we see a letter by a worker in the U.S. Sanitary Commission in late 1864 who was observing the Union Depot at City Point, Virginia. The comments were as follows. The evils of this place. This is a whole city of whores. 3 parallel streets about 4 blocks long each. 10 structures on either side of each block. At paytime, the lines before these houses are appalling. The average charge is $3, and some whores make as much as $250 to $300 per day. Grant ordered our men not to rape the rebel women under penalty of death. Once again, I can make an apology but also explanation for some of the graphic language that appears in this lecture, and particularly here from the actual words of fighting soldiers. I think it's important to record this information from a historical standpoint, but it can be offensive certainly to any number of people. Then there was a dire entry from a Confederate soldier, Harris Levin of the 2nd Virginia Reserves, penned in late 1864 from his position at Drury's Bluff, Virginia. Several nights a week, our lovely post is visited by 2 sisters who are rentable for writing. Amanda is about 15. Her sister Carrie will ask for pay. Harris Levin then continued. Sometimes they bring and this is a derogatory term for a black person, the word begins with N, and the gentlemen prefer her, but I have never had wealth enough to acquire such tastes. We next have the words of Sergeant A.L.P. Varon, who was stationed near Weldon, North Carolina in 1862, a Confederate stronghold. He said, "This section of the country seems to abound in very bad women." We have the words of Private Orville Bumpus, fighting in northern Alabama. He said, "The state of morals is quite as low as the soil. Almost all the women are given to whoredom, and the ugliest, barefooted, dirty wretches you ever saw." There was a Massachusetts soldier fighting in Virginia in April of 1863, Eli Vesey, visiting Washington, D.C. at the time, and Eli stated, "Had a gay old time, lager beer, horizontal refreshments, riding a Dutch gal. I see any quantity of women around a plenty whores." Soldier Frank Lyman from New Hampshire was stationed at City Point, and in his letter stated the following, "We cannot get anything here but bleeping, and that is plenty." We have Samuel Jarrett of Pennsylvania, who was occupying Savannah, Georgia in 1864, and Samuel said, "There are so many whorehouses in town which must have a sentinel at each door for to keep them straight." Soldier E.H.C. Cavins of an Indiana regiment was camped near Alexandria, Virginia in 1863. He said, "One house in every 10 is a bawdy house. It is a perfect Sodom. The result will be that in a week there will be an increase in sickness in camp." Henry C. Bear of Illinois described his lieutenant who kept a woman dressed in soldier's clothes. He said, "There's a few in our company that would love to have a rip at her. You can hardly tell her from a man." We also hear stories of a pair of cousins from Virginia, Mary and Molly Bell, who spent 2 years with one of Confederate General Jubal Early's regiments. The Richmond Enquirer reported in October of 1864 that the Bells were imprisoned for, quote, "aiding in the demoralization of General Early's veterans," end quote. These women were later imprisoned at Richmond's Castle Thunder. Finally, we have some words from Henry Schnelling of Illinois, who was marching through Tennessee at the time in November of 1863. Writing to a friend, he said, "I hope you will be in Charleston soon. You will have lots of niggers bleeping, and I will try to get a little white skin. There are 4 whorehouses where a man can get a simple jump for $3, $5 for all night. You may think I am a hard case, but I am as pious as you can find in the Army. The circulation of pornography during the war is certainly an interesting subject. The 1863 catalog of G.S. Hoskins and Company out of New York contained 23 pornographic titles, including the famous book Fanny Hill, The Lustful Turk, and The Libertine Enchantress. For $1, one could purchase Matron's Manual of Midwifery, Prostitution in Paris, Male Generative Organs, or Aristotle Illustrated. For 50 cents, one could choose among 9 titles, including Venus in Cloister, The Marriage Bed, Secret Passions, and The Physiology of Love. Hoskins offered other merchandise like spicy songbooks, transparent playing cards watermarked with naked women, French ticklers, love powders, dildos, condoms, and stereoscopic pictures. Other publishers circulated books like Catalog of Fancy Photographs, The Book of Nature, and The Wedding Night. Another publisher, Thomas Ormsby, sent soldiers a flyer listing pornographic goods in an envelope with patriotic symbols. Ormsby enclosed his card in a list of medical advice books, including Aristotle's masterpiece, The Secrets of Generation, and several works on reform physiology by Origin of Life author Frederick Hollick. Far more racy offerings could be found in the accompanying Private Circular for Gentlemen Only. This offered fancy literature, erotic and even pornographic pictures, contraceptives such as French condoms, and sex toys. Ormsby's business address appeared nowhere on the circular, and he promised to send the material anonymously, quote, in such a manner as to defy detection, end quote. Over the last 150 years, almost all these books have been destroyed. All had a common size, about 3 inches by 4 inches, which was an ideal size for a knapsack or a uniform pocket, and bound in black cloth so easily mistaken as a Bible. Surviving pornographic photography from the 1860s is rare, but probably not rare during the war itself. In 1842, the first U.S. Customs law outlining the importation of pornographic materials was enacted. There was no domestically produced pornography in the United States at that time, not until this import ban was enacted. However, by the 1860s, several American wholesalers had built a successful network of domestically produced and distributed erotica. Letters and supplies, including pornography, moved quickly and cheaply during the war, reached Union men in camp and on the move. There seems to have been no shortage of obscene materials available and widely circulated to soldiers during the Civil War, either via mail or through sutlers, which were vendors following the armies. In the mid-19th century, novel Fanny Hill was one of the most popular pornographic novels about the sexual exploits of a naive English country girl lured into a life of prostitution in London, including sex between women and sex in public. We now focus on the subject of prostitution. There certainly were abundant houses of prostitution around cities such as captured southern cities and the capital, Washington, D.C., where a large number of Union troops were occupying at the time. It was also common for prostitutes to follow the armies in the field. In Washington, D.C., the area now occupied by the Federal Triangle was at the time 13 blocks of vice, a dense warren of low saloons, brothels, hideouts for pimps, thieves, and pickpockets. 2 of those prostitution establishments are pictured here. The area between Constitutional Avenue and Pennsylvania Avenue was filled with gamblers, thieves, and prostitutes, an area referred to at the time as Murder Bay. It also came to be known as Hooker's Division, taking the name of Union General Fighting Joe Hooker. However, we can trace the use of the term hooker to prostitution prior to the war, so it was not taken exclusively from General Hooker's army. The situation in Washington grew so chaotic that Union General Joseph Hooker concentrated sex workers in an area near the Potomac River, giving rise to that famous nickname for this red light district, Hooker's Division. At the intersection of 13th and D Streets, there were dozens of bawdy houses operated in defiance of the law. Poorer prostitutes congregated in Murder Bay. Younger and more beautiful girls occupied attractive houses in better residential areas of Washington, D.C. Nearly all the brothels illegally sold liquor. There were 450 registered bawdy houses in 1862 in Washington. In 1863, an estimated 5,000 prostitutes occupied the town, along with another 2,500 prostitutes in nearby Georgetown and Alexandria. For a reference, you may cite the Table of Registered Bawdy Houses in Washington, D.C., 1864 through 65, that is published in Lowry's book. As we now move to the Confederate capital in Richmond, as we've noted before, many Confederate records were lost or destroyed that may have documented sexual activity and offenses in the Confederate capital. There in Richmond, the center of social life was an area 4 blocks southwest of Capitol Square, especially the Ballard and the Exchange hotels, which are pictured here, and the two hotels were actually joined across the street by a covered walkway. There were 40 gambling establishments in Richmond. High-class harlots lived upstairs above the gambling dens and along Locust Street. Another area in Richmond was along Main and Carey Streets and was a center for illegal liquor sales, alcoholic whores, pickpockets, and cutthroats. As you move west out Broad Street from the city center, there was the suburb referred to as Screamersville, named for shouting men in delirium tremors. The Daily Dispatch in Richmond reported a flood of prostitutes into the city of both sexes, on the sidewalks, in hacks, and in carriages. Away from the Eastern Theater, we now have prostitution west, centered around Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville surrendered to the Union Army on February 27, 1862. 30,000 Yankee troops flooded the city, with epidemics of venereal disease soon to follow. The so-called Smoky Row District was 8 full blocks of prostitution in Nashville. The pre-war 1860 census listed 207 female prostitutes, 198 of which were white and 9 were mulatto. In Nashville, a system of licensed prostitutes emerged, as well as the creation of a hospital for prostitutes on the western edge of the city. Also created was a soldier syphilitic hospital. By 1864, 352 women had licensed as prostitutes in Nashville. Nashville was an experiment of sorts during its occupation by the Union Army, as they initiated a system of legalized prostitution and medical testing to combat soaring rates of venereal disease. Doctors documented more than 183,000 cases of sexually transmitted infections across all Union forces. Memphis, Tennessee, as an occupied southern city, also had prostitution issues. General Tecumseh Sherman and the Union Army entered Memphis in July of 1862. Prostitutes from all over the country flocked to provide services. By July of 1864, Memphis was placed under martial law. There was an attempt by Union officials to register prostitutes so they could receive medical inspection. A private female ward in the new city hospital was created. In the first 5 months, 134 prostitutes registered. By the spring of 1865, the program was abolished. Memphis and Nashville were the only experiments in government-regulated prostitution until Nevada legalized prostitution in 1971. Public order in those southern towns was improved. Disease was reduced in Memphis and Nashville. Facing an epidemic of venereal disease, the Union Army tried a novel solution, government-sanctioned prostitution, in Nashville and Memphis from 1863 through 1865. Nashville at first expelled women of, quote, vile character, end quote, sending them upriver to Cincinnati, only to see them turned away. Colonel George Spaulding, who was provost marshal of Nashville, introduced a system of licensed prostitution, with periodic medical exams and hospital treatment for venereal disease. The number of licensed prostitutes rose and fell with the transit of troops through the city, but the incidence of disease sharply declined. A report issued after the war proclaimed the experiment a success, as testified by the influx of prostitutes. Many of the better class of prostitutes had been drawn to Nashville from northern cities by the comparative protection from venereal diseases which its license system afforded. In Memphis, a program of registration, inspection, treatment, and licensing met with similar success until closed at the war's end. The report of the Surgeon General of the United States, William Hammond, concluded that, while it does not encourage vice, it prevents to a considerable extent its worst consequences, referring to their regulation of prostitution. Forms of contraception were present during the Civil War. Condoms were available in 1860, but at that time were made from lamb cecums or appendix. Rubber condoms were not available until 1876. For women, douching after sex utilized a variety of chemicals, but was not a very effective method of contraception. Females tried the use of sponges. Then the issue of abortion, which was tried unsuccessfully and dangerously during the Civil War. There were non-surgical abortion methods using a variety of chemicals and herbs to induce abortions. And then there were surgical abortions, which included cervical dilatation, suction devices, and even electrodes. Attempts were made to treat rampant venereal disease during the Civil War, although available treatments were far from effective. The causes of contagious disease were very much unknown in the 1860s, and no germ theory had yet been developed in America. European investigators like Pasteur, Lister, and Koch did develop germ theory of disease, but this was not accepted in American medicine until years after the Civil War. There were a wide variety of ineffective treatments for venereal disease. These include things like mercury compounds. Mercury was the primary treatment for syphilis. It was prescribed as blue mass pills rubbed into the skin as an ointment or inhaled as a vapor. Mercury often caused severe side effects, including extreme salivation, tooth loss, and the rotting of facial tissue. There were metal injections to treat gonorrhea. Surgeons frequently irrigated the urethra with this astringent solutions containing various metals, such as silver nitrate, to flush out the infection and reduce inflammation. Then there were urethral syringes. Patients were treated with abortive injections directly into the urethra to stop the discharge associated with gonorrhea. Among Union white troops, there were reported 73,382 cases of syphilis. By the way, tertiary syphilis, also known as neurosyphilis, is a terrible disease and may be fatal. There were also reported 109,397 cases of gonorrhea. Sources for much of this information come from the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion, which I cited earlier. The rates of all venereal disease cases were 82 per 1,000 men. This was in 1860, just before the war. The highest reported rate was 461 cases per 1,000, reported in 1862, early in the war, and these were among West Coast Union regiments. An estimated one-third of men who died in Union and Confederate veterans' homes were killed by the late stages of venereal disease, including tertiary syphilis. During the American Civil War, venereal diseases, predominantly syphilis and gonorrhea, were widespread, with the Union Army alone recording roughly 200,000 cases. Because safe and effective antibiotics did not yet exist, treatments were largely ineffective, experimental, and often caused more harm than the diseases themselves. Looking at the disturbing subject of sexual assaults during the Civil War, we find limited data on the Confederate side again due to loss of records. Confederate court-martial records were burned when Richmond fell. In general, rape was often punished by execution. Otherwise, sentences of years of hard labor were handed down. On the other hand, rape was probably relatively rare during the Civil War. Only 22 Union soldiers were actually executed for rape. Union soldiers' most likely victims were black Southern slaves in occupied Confederate territory. In general, a surprisingly high percentage of Union common soldiers had little respect for black populations of the South, as expressed in their letters and diaries. There were multiple court-martial trials for rape, including many officers, but they were not always successful in obtaining convictions. We find data from the Union Judge Advocate Corps records, over 400 soldiers court-martialed for sexual crimes on the Union side. Chapter 12 of Lowry's book cites multiple examples of arrests and trials for sexual assault. Statistically, there were more frequent incidents of sexual assault by Union troops on Southern women and Southern slaves than there were Confederate troops committing sexual assault in the North. This is because Union troops spent much of their service in Southern territories, but there were only two major Confederate excursions into Northern territory, those at Antietam and Gettysburg, and the rebel troops did not stay long after those battlefield defeats. Robert E. Lee himself was strict, at least during his biggest northern invasion of Gettysburg, very strict about his troops interfering with local populations in Maryland and Pennsylvania. There tended to be more sexual episodes for Union troops camped near urban areas than there were troops out in the fields. In any discussion of legislation that emerged from this era in order to control prostitution or pornography, really the only meaningful legislation evolved either during the last few months of the war or more significantly in the years following the war. There was the 1865 Postal Act, which was driven by Postmaster General Dennison's concern over the vulgar material circulating through the military mail. President Lincoln himself signed a Senate motion into law on March 3, 1865, again in the last month or so of the war. This empowered postal officials to seize and destroy obscene publications, although it protected the privacy of first-class mail by forbidding officials from breaking mail seals.